This episode of Tools for the Future is all about design thinking, what differentiates it from other kinds of problem-solving systems. Design can teach business important lessons, and this is probably one of the most important. Undoubtedly, you've probably heard about design thinking, and depending on how it's applied, its meaning may change in different contexts. The squiggle diagram is often how design thinking is portrayed, both by designers and non-designers, and it can definitely feel like this while it's happening in the middle of the design process, even though the process is structured and plannable. Regardless of how much experience designers have, we routinely start projects with the anxiety that we might never create a successful response to that project's challenges. What gets us through is trust in the design thinking process. Design means different things to different people and in different contexts, but mostly these definitions come down to two. When people say design, often they mean the craft of design. They might mean fashion design or interior design, product design or graphic design. But in each of these cases, they're talking about a design craft, often that requires many years of experience to do well. The second meaning for design is what we refer to in design thinking. What we're talking about here is the process of design, not the artifacts. I'm not going to focus today on the craft of design. This episode is all about design thinking as a process. Design thinking differs from other kinds of problem solving. Undoubtedly, you've heard of the scientific method, or we all know deductive thinking from Sherlock Holmes. You may or may not have heard of inductive thinking or integrative thinking or systems thinking, but design thinking is a problem-solving process comparable to these other five. Each of these problem-solving processes have their strengths and weaknesses, which means that they're more or less appropriate in different kinds of contexts, depending on what the variables are, what's known, or what the outcome needs to be. Where design thinking excels is in creating new models when none of the previous models or existing models satisfy the needs. Design also excels in ambiguous situations when the context isn't very clear. The main components of design thinking that separates it from other kinds of problem solving include design research, reframing, prototyping, and critique culture. These four elements aren't a part of other problem-solving processes. To start with, design research is a different kind of research. It's not the same as what's often done in market research. Design research specifically looks for qualitative context, which is a different kind of data than quantitative data. The context for market research is almost always focused on quantitative data, and qualitative data often gets ignored entirely in companies. To understand the context of a market or a customer or an industry, it's important to both understand the qualitative and the quantitative data. Design research uses specific processes to understand a context for customers, for instance, with empathy and a specific focus on identity, meaning, emotions, as well as functionality and price. Without the rich information that comes from design research, most organizations have a poor understanding of the context that they're designing for. This almost always leads them to design and develop the wrong things. Perhaps the most important part of the design thinking process is actually one of the most scary and frustrating, and this is the process of reframing. Once the research comes back from the design research process, almost always the results are that the original solution envisioned is probably not the right solution. In fact, very often, the assumptions made about customers and markets and competition and contexts are absolutely wrong once you've been in the field. Reframing is a process of taking this data, gleaning insights from it, and using those insights and reframe the understanding of the challenge to begin with. Nowadays, reframing is called pivoting, where a team or an organization changes its focus and direction on what it's trying to do and how it's trying to serve customers. Without this reframing or this pivoting, almost always, when an organization ignores the research and the insights from design research, it means that a failure is looming and nobody wants to deal with it. Another tenet of design thinking is prototyping. The idea of prototyping is to try little experiments towards the solution in order to discover what works and what doesn't before moving on to bigger and bigger constructions. It's often said that it's much cheaper to fail early or even fail often as long as you're learning from those failures and putting those learnings forward towards subsequent solutions. Prototyping is about failing when the costs are low and learning from them, that's key, so that failure of the ultimate product or service doesn't happen. Many people that don't have a design background misunderstand prototyping. Prototyping isn't just testing assumptions. Prototyping is about testing solutions as well, or design responses. And without those tests, it's not possible to get the design right. Therefore, the prototypes are an integral part of finding the solution. Whether or not they're successful, the learnings from them are absolutely critical, and a successful solution wouldn't be possible without them. Lastly, critique culture is an integral part of design and architecture, art, and a few other disciplines. Critique is all about helping something to be better by getting input from multiple perspectives and people from multiple experiences. It is never possible for one person to know absolutely everything relevant about any kind of solution, let alone a complicated or systemic one. So we look to find insight and feedback or critique from other experts and other people who have perspectives that aren't like our own. This is critical because they'll see things and they'll suggest things that would have never occurred to us that very likely may be better than the assumptions that we made or the design solutions we made originally. It's important to understand and recognize that critique culture isn't about tearing something down. It's about pointing out things of concern or things of success, moments of delight that otherwise would be missed by the people who are heads down focused on the project. Very often, constructive critique creates breakthroughs that allow a project to find even better success. There are many qualitative research techniques that are important in design research. These fall outside of the typical market research processes. For example, one-on-one and other types of interviews, very careful surveys, shadowing people in their natural environment, laddering, which is a way of having a conversation with people to dig out what's most important to them without explicitly asking them what's most important. Often even playing games with people in order to observe their reactions to things and therefore their understandings, their preferences, and their needs. One of the most interesting books about how to research important things that are often invisible and lost in other methods is The Meaning of Things. This is also one of the few books I've ever read that talks about the construction of meaning. And it's worth a read just to understand how he went about deconstructing and researching how people create meaning in their lives and around what kinds of objects they imbue meaning with. This also aligns with what we know about the 5 kinds of value. People constantly and regularly measure, whether they're conscious of it or not, the worth of a solution or products and services based on 5 different levels of value: functional, financial, emotional, identity, and meaningful. Unfortunately, most people and most businesses are taught to only focus on 2 kinds of value, functional and financial. And these are almost always the weakest kind of value and the least stable kinds of value of all the 5. Without realizing it, most people ask themselves a series of questions when they evaluate choices about what to buy or engage with that follow all 5 of these levels. Does this do what I need? Does it do it at the right price? Does it have all the right features? Does it perform well? How does it make me feel? Does it appeal to me and my sense of identity? And does it fit in my world? Meaning is a palette of priorities we engage with in the world and how we understand the world to be. Meaning is something we all create and react to and understand, though we don't always acknowledge it. And there are 15 core meanings that are absolutely universal. These form the building blocks of building more meaningful products and services and other experiences that have deeper, more stable value for people. You can't get at these core meanings or many of the other important aspects of decision-making on the basis of customers without employing qualitative design research techniques. That's why they're so important. One of the most important things about design thinking as a process is that there are different steps that require different kinds of skills at different times. This is a Ambassador system of classifying not only different kinds of people, but of different kinds of activities in the innovation process. All of us have skills in all four of these, but we have particular strengths and orientations in only a few of them. What's critical here is to know that during this process, the skills that need to take a lead at that step in the process are critical. This is also the basis of forming more successful innovation teams. For instance, if you have too many of one type of person, let's say implementers, and no generators, when you start with the part of the process that is about understanding the context, researching, finding insights, and generating possible paths forward, you might find that you have no one with strengths in those areas. This is a deficiency and could very easily lead the team to failure. Likewise, if you have too many people in one quadrant or not enough people in another, it means that at some point during the innovation process or the design thinking process, the team is going to get bogged down and risk failure. In addition, who manages the team at any point in these processes is also critical. If you have implementers in charge during a generation or conceptualization phase, they will very often overpower the skills that are needed at any particular point and, in essence, ruin the outcomes. Similarly, if you have generators or conceptualizers in charge during the implementation of a project, very often they're searching for new alternatives rather than trying to narrow down the alternatives to decisions and implementing them. Again, the emphasis on the skills may not match the emphasis on the step in the process. Over everything else, design tends to clarify ambiguity when it's employed well. In addition, design creates new value, and this is why it's so critical to innovation efforts. Now, there are a lot of different processes for design. The traditional way that design and engineering worked is called the Waterfall Process because it organizes the different activities and groups into a sequence. One sequence can't start until the sequence before it has been completed. There are a lot of good reasons for this, specifically when functionality is critical or safety is paramount. Over the last 20 to 25 years, we've seen a process evolve called Agile. And the point of Agile is to start working immediately and start tackling the problems and creating solutions. Often in engineering, you start writing code and keep iterating around that code and improving it and adding new functionality as you go until you have a finished product. Now, there's some very good things about Agile, but where's design in this process? In fact, where is research? And where is the opportunity for reframing? Where can we question whether this is the right thing to build at all? And where does that get validated? And I ask those questions because they're all missing from the Agile process. In fact, Agile has no place for design at all. And that's a big problem, not just for design, but for the company itself. Because if there's no design research function, there's no reframing opportunity, and there's no design thinking taking place, it's not likely that there's a path for success. So why would Agile be helpful to begin with? Agile isn't the only current business process that should be rethought. Very often in the tech world especially, but in investment in general, you hear about minimal viable product. but minimal viable product is almost always the wrong approach. Now, part of this is just because of how minimal and viable and product get defined by people. The original idea of minimal viable product is actually a good one, which is what's the minimum amount of functionality and features and experience that we can put into the market and have something viable that can be a successful solution. That makes a tremendous amount of sense. However, how this plays out in practice is very different, unfortunately. Often, especially in the tech industry, minimal viable product means what's the minimum we can get away with and put something in the market to show that we're in the market. And there's often no understanding or no acknowledgement about the reality of the competition. For example, when Microsoft came out with their Zune MP3 player to compete against the iPod, it was the minimal viable product, literally. It was the minimum amount of features that made it arguably viable as an MP3 player, and it was a product. The problem was they weren't competing against a minimal viable product on Apple's side. The iPod was not a minimal viable product. It was a huge, multifaceted system of music solutions that became a platform that the Zune could never compete with such minimal functionality. Yes, the Zune was well designed and it came in nice colors and it had a feature or two that the iPod didn't. But at that point, the iPod wasn't the product. It was a piece of a much larger ecosystem that involved music and podcasts, books and movies, online stores, and a host of accessories and other products that built out an incredibly diverse and rich experience. There was no way that one product was ever going to compete against that. So when you hear someone talk about MVP, you should probably think about maximal viable experience, because most of your customers are not living in a minimal viable world. Even where organizations try to integrate design with Agile, it often negates any value for design. All of the same questions still need to be asked, and these models still relegate design only to being about the production of screens and artifacts, because at this point, with these kinds of integration, that's all design ever could be. When we look at the overall design process, there are actually two parts. The box on the right is about a typical product and service development process, but the box on the left represents strategy within an organization. So while on the right, the focus is on answering the question, how should we make this thing in the best possible way? The questions that are focused on in the left are things like, what business should we be in? And what should we be making or offering in the first place? As you can imagine, the decisions on the left have a huge impact on the decisions on the right. And in fact, if the conclusion from the strategic process is to develop the wrong thing, no amount of work or focus or skills on the right can make up for that. The dirty little secret of Silicon Valley is that over 95% of all companies fail. And it's not just Silicon Valley. That's most of entrepreneurship. But in Silicon Valley, those companies weren't failing because they didn't make a good product or they didn't build it well. They failed because it wasn't anything anyone really needed or wanted. And those decisions don't get made in the product development process. They get made in the corporate strategic process. So as designers, our ability to employ our skills and do good design is absolutely limited by the decisions that are made before we even get a product brief. Again, the process of design, including design thinking, isn't really the problem here. The challenge is, how do we take our understandings of our customers, which are completely different than the understandings of customers and industry and competition that is developed in market research? How do we take those insights and get them into the strategic development process where they can have the most impact, so that the outcome is that the decision is made to build the right thing in the first place? Without moving into the corporate strategic process, designers are laming themselves and their influence, and they're almost assuring themselves to be set up for failure. Now we can look at the design deliverables of the design thinking process, and we don't have to get too detailed here, but there are specific kinds of deliverables that deal with the qualitative data that we find and the kind of insights that we derive, how we prototype, and how we communicate what it is that we're designing all the way through the development process in collaboration with engineers and product managers and other professionals that we collaborate with in order to make a solution real. None of these are any more important than the other, but all of them help us to build a more well-rounded and fuller view of what the context is, and therefore the needs and desires of the market, as well as how we can meet those needs with a viable solution that we can build with the technology at hand and do so successfully. Unfortunately, the design industry is famous for overcomplicating how it communicates what it does. We have a tendency to break up what's important about the design process into smaller and smaller discrete parts and atomize what we do as a designer. But this does a disservice to all of design. But the reality is that you can't have a successful solution if you've broken the process into discrete parts that are done either independently or even in coordination with others, unless someone has a vision of the entire whole in their heads and they're directing the development. To start with, whenever you hear product, nearly always what you're talking about is a service. So already we don't have our minds in the right place to develop the kinds of solutions that we need. It's also not necessary or helpful in any way to break these parts into smaller and smaller pieces because it creates distraction and disconnection not only in the process but between the people. Likewise, the alphabet soup of constantly changing acronyms in our own industry doesn't help either. Any organization that is breaking these ideals into separate functions are just asking for disconnected, unsuccessful services. All of these things on the screen are exactly the same. Now, for historical reasons, they have different terms and names because they've evolved over time with different sets of people from different disciplines. But if you and your organization aren't taking the whole into account, you're flirting with failure. And anyone who focuses vehemently on the differences between these acronyms is doing everyone a disservice. Design deliverables are becoming more and more varied, are becoming ever more strategic, are moving outside of the traditional realms of the design function. And that's because we're usually the ones that keep the customer's needs and desires and the experience that we're trying to build with them in mind in a way that almost no one else in an organization does. We are the champion for customers and users. We are the champion for qualitative needs and value. And very often we have to explain ourselves and validate our design decisions in a way that others in an organization don't need to. This requires us to take on ever more strategic and quote-unquote business-like deliverables in order to show that our decision-making process is valid and on the right track and more likely to lead to success. So where we used to worry more about wireframes and visual design and interactive prototypes and site maps and customer personas, etc., more and more we have to be able to speak the language of business and talk about competitive analyses and environmental analyses and business strategy and goals in order for us to be successful at the jobs that we're trying to accomplish. I know that's a tall order, but if designers want to have the influence that they think they deserve, or quite frankly, that they do deserve in service of the customer's needs, we need to learn to speak different languages. We need to learn to speak to different concerns in order to make our understandings and insights known to the rest of the organization. That's a tall order, but that's where design thinking leads us. Thank you.